The champagne tower sparkled under crystal chandeliers at the Biltmore Resort in Phoenix, and somewhere between the fourth toast and the cutting of the 7-tier cake, my brother Preston leaned into the microphone with that perfect smile he'd been practicing since high school. His new wife Vanessa glowed beside him in a gown that cost more than most people's cars, and the crowd of 200 guests hung on every word like he was delivering a State of the Union address instead of a wedding speech. "I want to thank everyone who made this day possible," Preston said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "My parents, who taught me the value of hard work and excellence. My beautiful bride's family, who welcomed me with open arms. My colleagues from Hartman and Associates, who took a chance on a kid from Scottsdale." He paused for effect, letting the applause wash over him like he was born for this exact moment. "And of course, my little sister Natalie, who couldn't make it work in the real world but at least she tried." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The laughter that followed wasn't cruel exactly, more like the polite chuckle you give when someone makes an awkward joke at a dinner party. But I heard it. Sitting 3 tables back in a dress I'd bought on sale, watching my father's approving nod and my mother's tight smile, I heard every single note of that laughter. My best friend Keisha squeezed my hand under the table so hard I thought she might break bones. "Should we leave?" she whispered, her eyes flashing with the kind of loyalty that makes you grateful for the family you choose. I shook my head slowly, keeping my expression neutral. Because here's what none of them knew, not Preston with his corner office and his imported Italian shoes, not my parents who'd flown in their country club friends to witness their golden son's perfect day, not Vanessa's parents who kept asking me in that sweet concerned voice what I was doing with my life these days. They didn't know that in 72 hours, would sit across from Richard Chen on CNN's Power Player Spotlight, and the world would learn that the scruffy freelancer they'd written off as the family disappointment had just become the youngest self-made female billionaire in clean energy technology. They didn't know that while Preston was choosing between the salmon and the filet mignon for his reception dinner, I was signing papers that would take my company GridSync Technologies public at a valuation that would make his annual salary look like lunch money. They didn't know that Ethan, the quiet guy in the simple gray suit sitting beside me, the one my mother had pulled me aside earlier to express concern about because he ran what she called a little solar panel business, had a PhD from Stanford and had turned down a full professorship to build something that actually mattered. But they were about to find out, and when they did, everything would change. Not because I wanted revenge, though I won't lie and say the thought didn't cross my mind during Preston's speech. But because sometimes the universe has a way of revealing truth in the most public way possible, and all you can do is stand there and let it unfold. Growing up as a Harper in Paradise Valley meant understanding from a very young age that appearances weren't just important, they were everything. Our house sat on 3 acres of perfectly manicured desert landscape, all native plants arranged in a way that looked natural but cost a fortune in landscaping fees. My father Vincent ran a commercial real estate development firm that specialized in luxury properties across the Southwest, the kind of projects that got written up in architecture magazines and won sustainability awards that were more about optics than actual environmental impact. My mother Diane spent her days on charity boards and her evenings hosting dinner parties where the guest list read like a who's who of Phoenix society. She wore her platinum hair in a sleek bob that never moved, even in the desert wind, and her jewelry was always real, always tasteful, always just expensive enough to communicate status without appearing gauche. Everything in the Harper household had a purpose, a message, a carefully calculated position in the social hierarchy we were meant to maintain. Preston understood this instinctively. 3 years older than me, he seemed to have been born knowing exactly what our parents wanted before they even asked. He played lacrosse because that's what boys from good families played. He dated girls whose fathers belonged to the right clubs. He got a business degree from USC, then a law degree from Georgetown, checking boxes with the efficiency of someone filling out a form they'd memorized years ago. By the time he joined Hartman and Associates, one of the most prestigious corporate law firms in the Southwest, he'd already cultivated the kind of network that would sustain him for life. I tried to follow the script at first. I really did. I joined the right clubs at our private school, volunteered at the charity galas my mother organized, smiled through the endless dinners where adults asked me what I planned to study in college with that tone that suggested there were exactly 3 acceptable answers. But somewhere around my junior year of high school, when I took an environmental science elective because it fit my schedule and ended up completely obsessed with renewable energy systems, the path my parents had laid out for me started to feel like wearing someone else's shoes. I remember the dinner where I told them I wanted to study environmental engineering instead of business or pre-law. My father set down his fork with the kind of deliberate precision that signaled disappointment. Engineering, he repeated, like I'd suggested becoming a professional clown. Natalie, sweetheart, that's a very technical field. Very male-dominated. Are you sure you've thought this through? My mother jumped in with her concerned face, the one she used when she was about to redirect you toward the correct choice while making it seem like she was supporting your autonomy. What your father means is that there are so many wonderful programs in business sustainability or environmental policy. You could still work in that field but position yourself for leadership roles, networking opportunities with the right people. The right people. That phrase came up a lot in our house. Preston was dating the right people. We vacationed in the right places. We supported the right causes, the ones that came with good press and better tax benefits. The right people didn't get their hands dirty with actual engineering work. They managed the people who did. I went to the University of Colorado Boulder anyway, partially because their engineering program was excellent and partially because putting a few states between myself and Paradise Valley felt necessary for my survival. My parents attended graduation with smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes, and when I told them I'd accepted a position with a small renewable energy consulting firm in Denver instead of applying to the corporate training programs Preston had lined up for me, the smiles disappeared entirely. Consulting, my father said, and the word sounded like an accusation. That's not a real job, Natalie. That's what people do between real jobs. Preston, who'd flown in for my graduation with his girlfriend of the moment, a publicist named Tiffany who wore too much perfume, put his arm around me in that big brother way that always felt more condescending than affectionate. Don't worry, Nat. Everyone needs time to figure things out. You'll find your footing eventually. Some of us just take longer than others. I moved into a small apartment in the low-high district of Denver, a place with exposed brick and windows that let in good light and rent that took most of my paycheck. The consulting firm paid okay, not great, and the work was interesting if repetitive. We assessed commercial buildings for energy efficiency, recommended solar installations, wrote reports that mostly sat in filing cabinets while companies checked boxes for their sustainability initiatives without actually changing much. But the job gave me something invaluable. It showed me how broken the entire system was. I spent 2 years watching perfectly good renewable energy solutions get rejected because they were too expensive, too complicated, too different from how things had always been done. I watched rural communities continue to pay astronomical electricity bills because extending the grid to reach them cost more than utility companies wanted to spend. I watched small businesses struggle to afford solar installations that would save them money in the long run because the upfront costs were prohibitive and the financing options were designed for corporations, not mom and pop shops. The problem wasn't technology. The problem was distribution, financing, and the kind of systemic thinking that required you to see the forest instead of just optimizing individual trees. And somewhere around my 3rd year in Denver, sitting in a coffee shop called Stella's Brew at 2 a.m. working on a proposal that I knew would get rejected, I started sketching out a different approach. What if you could create a microgrid system that was modular, scalable, and cheap enough to deploy in communities that the major utility companies ignored? What if you combined solar collection with battery storage and AI-driven distribution that could predict usage patterns and optimize energy flow in real time? What if instead of trying to sell massive installations to corporations, you built something that could be financed through community investment, municipal bonds, and a subscription model that made clean energy accessible to people who needed it most? I filled notebooks with calculations, stayed up late teaching myself machine learning, reached out to professors from Boulder who remembered me as the student who asked too many questions in their renewable systems seminars. The consulting firm let me go after I started showing up late too many times, distracted by the project that was taking over every spare moment I had. My parents called it quits on their weekly check-ins after I told them I was freelancing, which they translated correctly as unemployed and too proud to admit it. Preston started calling me his artistic sister at family gatherings, which was his way of saying I'd failed to launch. When I missed Thanksgiving because I couldn't afford the flight and also didn't want to sit through another dinner where everyone asked what I was doing with my life in that pitying tone, My mother left me a voicemail saying she understood I was going through a difficult time but family should come first. The difficult time was actually the most alive I'd ever felt. I was broke, exhausted, running on coffee and the kind of obsessive energy that comes from knowing you're onto something real. I picked up odd jobs doing energy audits for small businesses, lived on ramen and whatever Keisha cooked when she took pity on me, and slowly, piece by piece, built the prototype that would become GridSync. The technology worked. That was the beautiful, terrifying truth that kept me going through the months when my bank account hit double digits and my parents stopped asking about my plans because the silence was less painful than the answers. The AI distribution system I designed could reduce energy waste by 40% compared to traditional grid systems. The modular solar arrays could be installed in a fraction of the time of conventional systems. The financing model made clean energy accessible to communities that had been priced out of the renewable revolution. I just needed someone to believe in it enough to fund the next phase. And that's when I met Ethan Cole, though I didn't know then that meeting him would change everything about my life in ways that had nothing to do with technology. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The solar panel on my apartment building's roof had been malfunctioning for 3 weeks, and the property management company kept sending different technicians who poked at it, declared it beyond their expertise, and left. I'd finally gotten fed up enough to climb up there myself with a multimeter and my laptop, figuring I could at least diagnose the problem even if I couldn't fix it. That's how Ethan found me, crouched on the hot tar roof in cut-off shorts and a tank top, swearing at a junction box that had been installed backwards. "You're going to electrocute yourself," a voice said behind me, calm and matter-of-fact, no judgment in it. I turned to find a guy in worn jeans and a faded t-shirt that said Soulpath Solutions across the chest, tool belt slung low on his hips, sandy hair sticking up like he'd been running his hands through it. He had the kind of face that was hard to pin an age on, could have been 30 or 40, with permanent smile lines around his eyes that suggested he spent a lot of time outdoors. "The breaker's off," I said, defensive because I knew I looked like an idiot up there with my liberal arts approach to electrical systems. "The breaker's off on the building side," he corrected, walking over with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent a lot of time on roofs. But whoever installed this ran a secondary line straight from the panel without a shutoff. "See that conduit? It's hot." I looked where he was pointing and felt my stomach drop. He was right. I'd been about to stick my multimeter probes into a live 240-volt line. "Property management called us about the system failure," he continued, already pulling tools from his belt. "I'm Ethan. You live here?" "Natalie. And yeah, 3rd floor. I've been waiting weeks for someone who actually knows what they're doing." He grinned at that, a quick flash of amusement that transformed his whole face. "Well, you found him. Give me 20 minutes and I'll have your building back on solar." I should have gone back downstairs. I had work to do, proposals to write, investor emails to craft that I'd probably never send because the whole idea of cold emailing venture capitalists felt like shouting into a void. But something about watching Ethan work held me there on that roof. He didn't fumble or second guess. He just moved through the repair with the kind of fluid efficiency that comes from deep understanding, explaining what he was doing as he went like he was teaching a class. "The problem is these commercial installers treat every job like it's the same," he said, rewiring the junction box with hands that moved faster than I could follow. "They've got a script, a timeline, a budget. Doesn't matter if the building's wiring is ancient or if the roof orientation is wrong for their standard array layout. They just slap it up and move on to the next job." "Sounds like every consulting project I've ever worked on," I said. He glanced up at that, really looked at me for the first time. "You work in solar?" "Used to consult on energy efficiency. Now I'm between things." Between things was a generous way to describe my current situation, which was more accurately described as catastrophically underemployed and running out of savings, but it sounded better than admitting I'd quit my job to chase a dream that was starting to feel more like a delusion. "Between things," Ethan repeated, and something in his tone made me think he understood exactly what that meant. "I know that place. Spent 2 years there myself after I left academia." "You were a professor?" "Almost. got close enough to see how the sausage was made and decided I'd rather make something else. He finished the last connection, closed up the junction box, and stood, brushing tar off his knees. There. Your building's back on renewable energy. Try not to electrocute yourself checking on it. I laughed despite myself. No promises. But thank you. Really. The management company's been useless. They usually are. He paused, like he was deciding whether to say something, then seemed to commit to it. Look, I run a small installation company. We mostly do residential and community projects, places the big firms don't bother with. If you're looking for work and you actually understand energy systems instead of just pretending to, I could use someone who can talk to clients without making their eyes glaze over. It wasn't a real job offer, more like a casual suggestion made to fill awkward silence. But I heard myself saying yes anyway, giving him my number, agreeing to come by his shop the next day to talk details. Maybe it was the way he'd fixed the solar panel like it mattered, like it was worth doing right even though it was just a small building in a not particularly wealthy neighborhood. Maybe it was the way he'd said academia like it left a bad taste in his mouth, the same way I said consulting. Or maybe I was just desperate enough that any lifeline looked good. His shop turned out to be a converted garage in an industrial part of Denver that was slowly gentrifying, surrounded by craft breweries and artisan furniture makers. Inside was organized chaos, solar panels stacked against walls, spools of wire hanging from ceiling hooks, a workbench covered in tools and schematics and what looked like 3 different laptops in various states of being cannibalized for parts. Sorry about the mess, Ethan said, clearing a stack of permits off a folding chair so I could sit. I keep meaning to hire someone to organize this place, but then I'd never be able to find anything. It's fine. My apartment looks like this but with more coffee cups and fewer power tools. He made coffee in a French press that sat next to a drill press, and we talked for 2 hours about energy systems, about the gap between what technology could do and what actually got implemented, about the frustration of watching good solutions get rejected for stupid reasons. He told me about the community solar project he was working on in a small town outside Colorado Springs, a place where half the residents were on fixed incomes and the utility company had just announced another rate hike. The technology exists to make them energy independent, he said, and I could hear the frustration in his voice, the same frustration I carried around like a backpack full of rocks. But the upfront cost is impossible for a community that's already struggling. And the financing options that do exist are designed to extract maximum profit, not actually help people. What if you didn't need traditional financing? I heard myself ask, and suddenly I was pulling up files on my phone, showing him the grid sync concept I'd been developing, talking faster than I probably should have about modular systems and AI distribution and community investment models. Ethan listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from polite interest to focused attention to something that looked almost like excitement. When I finally stopped talking, breathless and probably sounding half crazy, he was quiet for a long moment. This is real, he said finally. I mean, you've actually built this? The AI distribution system? Prototype. It works on a small scale, like a single building. But the theory scales up, and I've run thousands of simulations. With the right funding for development, it could work for entire communities. How much funding are we talking? I told him the number I'd calculated, the amount that would let me hire a small team, build a full-scale pilot project, prove the concept beyond simulation. It wasn't an insane amount by Silicon Valley standards, but it might as well have been $1 billion for all the luck I'd had getting anyone to take it seriously. Ethan nodded slowly, like he was working through calculations in his head. What if I told you I know people who fund exactly this kind of project? Not venture capitalists looking for the next unicorn, but impact investors who actually care about whether the technology helps people. I'd say you're either very connected or very optimistic. Both, probably. He smiled that quick grin again. I spent 5 years in environmental engineering research before I started this company. Published a bunch of papers nobody read, attended conferences where everyone was more interested in grants than solutions. But I met people, made connections with folks who actually want to fix things. Let me make some calls. I should have been skeptical. I'd heard too many people promise to make calls, to introduce me to someone, to help me get my foot in the door, only to have those promises evaporate like morning dew. But something about Ethan felt different. Maybe it was the way he'd looked at my grid sync designs like they were blueprints instead of fantasies. Maybe it was the fact that his shop was full of actual completed projects instead of just talk and slideshow presentations. Why would you help me? I asked, because that question had been burning in the back of my mind since he first suggested I show him my work. You don't know me. This could be a waste of your time and your connections. Ethan was quiet for a moment, looking at the chaos of his workshop like it held answers. When I left Stanford, everyone told me I was throwing away my career. My advisor actually said I was being selfish, that I had an obligation to the field to stay in research, to mentor the next generation of graduate students, to publish papers that would advance the academic discourse. He said that last part with audible sarcasm. But you know what wasn't advancing? Actual implementation. Actual solutions getting to actual people who needed them. He turned back to me, and his expression was serious now, the easy humor gone. I see people all the time who have good ideas, solid technical skills, and no path forward because they don't fit the mold that investors or institutions are looking for. Usually it's because they care more about solving problems than maximizing returns. The system doesn't know what to do with people like that. But I do. I felt something shift in my chest, a loosening of tension I hadn't even realized I was carrying. For 2 years I'd been trying to make my project sound impressive enough, commercial enough, scalable enough to attract attention from investors who wanted hockey stick growth projections and exit strategies. But Ethan was looking at grid sync like the point was whether it worked, whether it helped, whether it mattered. Okay, I said. Make your calls. But I'm buying lunch while you do it, because if this actually goes somewhere, I want to remember that I contributed something. We ended up at a taco truck near his shop, eating carnitas and talking about everything except grid sync. I learned that Ethan had grown up in rural Oregon, that his dad had been a logger and his mom a schoolteacher, that he'd been the first person in his family to go to college and definitely the first to get a PhD. He asked about my family, and I found myself being more honest than I usually was, admitting that they thought I was wasting my potential, that my brother had the golden child role locked down, that going home for holidays felt like attending my own funeral where everyone was very polite about my career death. They think I run a small solar panel business, Ethan said, and there was amusement in his voice but also something harder underneath. Which technically I do. They just don't know about the rest of it. The rest of it? The published research. The patents. The consulting work I do for the Department of Energy. The fact that I turned down a position at Tesla because I didn't want to build toys for rich people. He shrugged. It's easier to let them think I'm just a guy who installs solar panels. Saves a lot of complicated conversations. I understood that completely. Sometimes it was easier to let people underestimate you than to constantly justify choices they'd never understand. My parents had stopped asking detailed questions about my work months ago, content to write me off as a disappointment who'd eventually come to her senses. Preston introduced me at family events as his sister who was figuring things out, which was code for failing at life but too proud to admit it. Do you ever want to prove them wrong? I asked. Just show up one day with evidence that they completely misjudged you? Ethan considered this, finishing his taco before answering. Sometimes. But then I remember that their judgment says more about them than it does about me. My work doesn't need their validation to matter. He was right, of course. But sitting there in the weak autumn sunshine, eating $5 tacos with a guy I'd met on a roof 12 hours ago, I couldn't help imagining what it would feel like to walk into a family dinner with proof that I wasn't the failure they thought I was. Not to be cruel about it, not to rub their faces in it, but just to stand there and let them see clearly for once. Ethan made his calls over the next week, and to my shock, people called back. Suddenly I was sending technical specifications to an impact investment firm in Boulder, scheduling video calls with a group that funded rural infrastructure projects, talking to a former Department of Energy official who transitioned to private sector consulting. The questions they asked were hard, the kind that required me to defend every assumption and justify every projection, but they were asking. They were taking grid sync seriously. In between investor meetings, I started helping Ethan with his community solar project in Colorado Springs. It wasn't paid work, not officially, but he'd show up at my apartment with breakfast burritos and blueprints, and we'd spend hours figuring out optimal panel placement or calculating load requirements or explaining to skeptical town council members why this wasn't some kind of scam. Working with Ethan felt different than any collaboration I'd experienced. He didn't need to be the smartest person in the room. When I had a better solution, he implemented it without ego. When he saw a flaw in my thinking, he pointed it out without making me feel stupid. We developed a rhythm, a way of problem solving that felt less like competition and more like building something together. My parents called in late October to remind me about Preston's engagement party in Scottsdale. I'd forgotten about it completely, too wrapped up in grid sync development and the Colorado Springs project to track family obligations. "It's black tie," my mother said, her voice carrying that edge it got when she suspected I was going to embarrass her. "Vanessa's family is flying in from Connecticut. Her father owns Sterling Investments, very prominent in the Northeast. This is important, Natalie." "I'll be there," I said, making mental calculations about whether I could afford a plane ticket and a dress that wouldn't scream I bought this on clearance. "And are you bringing someone? We need final numbers for the caterer." I glanced across my apartment where Ethan was sprawling on my couch, reviewing electrical diagrams with the focused intensity he brought to everything. We'd been spending so much time together that Keisha had started referring to him as my work husband, which wasn't entirely accurate but wasn't entirely wrong either. "Maybe," I said. "I'll let you know." After I hung up, Ethan looked up from the diagrams. "Family thing?" "My brother's engagement party. Black tie affair in Scottsdale, whole dog and pony show." "Sounds terrible." "It usually is." I hesitated, then figured I might as well ask. "Want to come? Be my buffer against invasive questions about my life choices?" He grinned. "Will there be free food?" "Expensive free food." "Then absolutely. I'll even wear a tie." The engagement party was exactly as insufferable as I'd anticipated. The Harper family estate had been transformed into something out of a luxury wedding magazine, with string lights wrapped around every palm tree and white roses everywhere you looked. Vanessa's family had arrived in force, her father Gerald Sterling holding court near the bar with my father and several other men in expensive suits, all of them radiating the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no about anything important. Preston looked like he'd stepped out of a Ralph Lauren advertisement, his hair perfectly styled, his tuxedo fitting like it had been painted on. Vanessa matched him in a champagne-colored gown that probably cost more than my rent, her engagement ring catching light like a small disco ball. They moved through the crowd together like politicians at a fundraiser, working the room with practiced ease. I'd found a simple black dress at a consignment shop that didn't embarrass me, and Keisha had done my hair in a way that looked elegant without trying too hard. Ethan had shown up at my hotel room in a charcoal suit that actually fit him well, his usually messy hair combed back, and I'd had a moment of cognitive dissonance seeing him look so polished. "You clean up nice," I'd said. "Don't get used to it. This tie is already trying to strangle me." We'd driven to the party together in his truck, which looked distinctly out of place among the Teslas and Mercedes parked in the circular driveway. A valet had given the truck a dubious look before taking the keys, like he wasn't sure where to put it that wouldn't offend the other vehicles. My mother spotted us immediately, her smile freezing slightly when she saw Ethan. She glided over with the practiced grace of someone who'd spent decades at events exactly like this, her dove gray dress and diamond necklace making a statement about taste and restraint. "Natalie, darling, you made it." She kissed the air near my cheek, then turned her attention to Ethan with the kind of assessing look she usually reserved for produce at the farmer's market. "And you brought a guest." "Mom, this is Ethan Cole." "Ethan, my mother Diane." "Lovely to meet you, Mrs. Harper," Ethan said, shaking her hand with easy confidence. "You have a beautiful home." "Thank you." "And what do you do, Ethan?" Here it came, the question that would determine his value in her social calculus. I watched my mother's face carefully, saw the exact moment Ethan's answer registered and was found wanting. "I run a renewable energy installation company in Denver. We do mostly residential and community solar projects." How interesting, my mother said in a tone that meant the exact opposite. So you work with your hands. Among other things, Ethan replied, and I caught the slight edge in his voice that suggested he knew exactly what she was doing. Turns out solar panels don't install themselves. My mother's smile tightened imperceptibly. Well, we're so glad you could join us. Natalie, your father wanted to speak with you. He's near the bar. It was a dismissal dressed as information. I squeezed Ethan's hand and headed toward where my father stood with Gerald Sterling and a small cluster of men who all looked vaguely similar, like they shopped at the same store and went to the same barber. There she is, my father said as I approached, his voice carrying that false heartiness he used when he wanted to sound proud but wasn't quite feeling it. Gentlemen, my daughter Natalie. Natalie, this is Gerald Sterling, Vanessa's father, and these are some colleagues from the club. I shook hands around the circle, noting the way their eyes slid past me with polite disinterest. I was the daughter who didn't matter, not the son they were really here to celebrate. Your father tells me you're in the energy sector, Gerald said, making conversation the way people do at parties when they're being polite. What firm are you with? I'm actually developing my own technology, I said. GridSync, it's an AI-driven microgrid distribution system for renewable energy. Ah, a startup. He said it the way you might say a hobby. That's ambitious. The energy sector can be quite challenging for new entrants. Lot of established players, high barriers to entry. That's what makes it interesting, I replied, keeping my voice level. The established players are focused on utility-scale projects and maximizing profit margins. There's a huge underserved market in rural and low-income communities that need clean energy but can't access it through traditional models. Gerald nodded with the expression of someone humoring a child. Well, passion is important in entrepreneurship. Though of course passion doesn't pay the bills. He chuckled, and the other men joined in with that knowing laugh that suggested they all understood the realities of business in a way I clearly didn't. My father jumped in, and I could hear the note of apology in his voice, like he needed to explain why his daughter was talking about unrealistic dreams at a respectable social gathering. Natalie's always been very idealistic. We keep hoping she'll consider something more stable, maybe come work with me at the firm, but she's determined to do her own thing. Nothing wrong with that, one of the other men said, his tone suggesting there was actually quite a bit wrong with it. Though eventually most people figure out that working within established systems is more practical than trying to reinvent wheels. I smiled politely and excused myself before I said something I'd regret. Found Ethan near the buffet table, loading a plate with expensive appetizers. How bad? He asked quietly. Scale of 1 to 10. About a 7. They're being polite about it. Want to leave? And miss the speeches? Where Preston will undoubtedly thank everyone who made him the success he is while carefully not mentioning the army of people who smoothed every path he ever walked. Ethan grinned. When you put it that way, this sounds unmissable. We found seats at a table toward the back as dinner was served. The couple next to us introduced themselves as friends of Vanessa's family from Connecticut, and the conversation quickly turned to real estate investments and vacation homes in places I'd never been. Across the table, a woman in too much jewelry was explaining to her husband why they absolutely needed to upgrade their yacht before next season. What do you two do? The woman asked eventually, that bright social smile that preceded judgment. I run a solar installation company, Ethan said. Natalie's developing clean energy technology. Oh, how wonderful, the woman said in that way that meant it wasn't wonderful at all. My nephew works in renewable energy too. He's an analyst at Goldman Sachs, covers the whole sector. Maybe you know him? I doubt it, I said. My work is more technical development than financial analysis. Still, such a small world. I'm sure your paths will cross eventually. She turned to her husband. Darling, didn't Richard say something about Goldman investing in solar companies? The conversation moved on, leaving Ethan and me on the outside of it. I caught him suppressing a smile, and when I raised an eyebrow, he leaned close and whispered, I published a paper 3 years ago that her nephew probably used in one of his reports. Want me to mention it? And destroy her illusion that we're adorable children playing at business? Never. Dinner dragged on through multiple courses, each one more elaborate than necessary. By the time dessert arrived, I was calculating whether we could slip out early without my mother noticing. That's when Preston stood up, champagne glass in hand, ready to deliver his remarks. He thanked the guests for coming, told the story of how he'd met Vanessa at a law conference where they bonded over their shared interest in mergers and acquisitions law, which sounded exactly as romantic as you'd expect. He praised Vanessa's family for welcoming him, thanked his parents for their guidance and support, mentioned his firm partners who'd mentored him. Then he spotted me in the back and his expression shifted, that big brother look he perfected that was half affection and half condescension. "I'd be remiss if I didn't mention my little sister Natalie," he said, and I felt every eye in the room turn toward our table. Nat's always been the creative one in the family, marching to the beat of her own drum. While some of us were climbing corporate ladders, she's been out in Denver trying to change the world one solar panel at a time. Polite laughter rippled through the crowd. Ethan's hand found mine under the table. "I admire her optimism, I really do," Preston continued, his smile never wavering. "Not everyone has the temperament for the real world, for the tough choices and compromises that come with actual success. But Natalie's out there giving it her best shot, and I think that's worth celebrating. Even if she is still figuring out what she wants to be when she grows up." More laughter, louder this time. Someone near the front actually applauded. I kept my face neutral, years of practice hiding how much his words landed. Next to me, I felt Ethan tense, his jaw tightening. "Easy," I whispered. "It's not worth it." But something had shifted in Ethan's expression, something I hadn't seen before. He leaned over and whispered back, "How would you feel about making this interesting?" "What do you mean?" "I mean your brother thinks you're a naive idealist playing at business. What if we showed him exactly how wrong he is?" Before I could respond, Preston raised his glass for a toast. "To family, to love, and to the future Mr. and Mrs. Preston Harper." Everyone drank, and as the evening shifted into mingling and dancing, my mother appeared at our table with Vanessa in tow. "Natalie," Vanessa wanted to say hello properly, my mother said. "You two didn't really get to chat at Christmas." Vanessa extended a perfectly manicured hand. "I've heard so much about you. Preston says you're very passionate about environmental causes." "Something like that," I replied, shaking her hand. "Congratulations on the engagement." "Thank you. We're so excited. Preston's been working on this huge merger at the firm, so the timing is perfect. Once that closes, we can really focus on wedding planning." She glanced at Ethan. "And you're Natalie's boyfriend?" "Ethan Cole," he said, standing to shake her hand with the kind of old-fashioned courtesy my mother usually approved of. "Pleasure to meet you." "Ethan runs a small business in Denver," my mother interjected, and I caught the subtle emphasis on small. "Solar installations." "How quaint," Vanessa said, and I genuinely couldn't tell if she was being condescending or if she thought quaint was a compliment. "Preston and I have been talking about adding solar to our new house in Paradise Valley. Maybe you could give us a quote?" "I mostly work in Colorado," Ethan said smoothly. "But I'd be happy to recommend someone local." "Oh, that's too bad. Though I suppose long-distance business relationships are complicated. Preston always says the key to success is being where the money is, and that's usually not in places like Denver." She smiled like she'd said something helpful. "No offense." "None taken," Ethan replied, but I saw the muscle jump in his jaw again. My father joined the cluster, Gerald Sterling beside him, and suddenly we were surrounded by the entire family power structure, all of them subtly or not so subtly assessing the person I'd brought into their orbit. "So Ethan," my father said, "Natalie mentioned you run an installation company. What's your background? Did you study business?" "Environmental engineering, actually. PhD from Stanford." That landed with visible impact. My father blinked. Gerald Sterling's eyebrows rose slightly. My mother's expression froze in confusion. "Stanford," my father repeated. "That's quite prestigious. Why on earth would you leave academia for installation work?" "Because installing solar panels is actually helping people access clean energy," Ethan said, his tone still polite but with an edge now. Academic papers mostly just help people get tenure. There was an awkward pause. Then Preston laughed, that big hearty laugh he used to diffuse tension at depositions. That's one way to look at it, he said. Though most people would consider a Stanford PhD a ticket to bigger opportunities than small-scale residential work. Seems like a waste of potential, but to each their own, I guess. Preston, I said quietly, warning in my voice. What? I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. The guy has impressive credentials and he's using them to install solar panels on middle-class houses. It's like getting a law degree from Yale and deciding to do traffic court. Gerald Sterling chuckled at that, nodding. The boy has a point. Nothing wrong with blue-collar work, but if you've got the education for something more ambitious, why not use it? Ethan's smile had gone cold. Because ambition without purpose is just ego with a business plan. I've seen plenty of people with Ivy League degrees making six figures doing work that doesn't matter to anyone except their shareholders. I'd rather make less money and know I'm actually solving problems for people who need solutions. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. My father's expression had shifted from polite confusion to something harder, the look he got when someone challenged his worldview in a way he couldn't easily dismiss. Well, my mother said brightly, desperate to smooth over the tension, I think it's wonderful that you're so committed to your values, Ethan. Even if they're a bit unconventional. Natalie, dear, why don't you show him the gardens? The lighting is lovely this time of evening. It was a clear dismissal, a way to remove the uncomfortable element from the polite conversation. I was angry enough to refuse, to stand there and make them sit with their own condescension, but Ethan touched my elbow gently. Gardens sound great, he said. Nice meeting all of you. We walked out through the French doors onto the sprawling back patio, past clusters of guests drinking expensive wine and laughing at jokes that probably weren't that funny. The air was cooler out here, desert night settling in with that sudden temperature drop that still surprised me even after growing up in Arizona. I'm sorry, I said once we were far enough away that no one could hear. They're worse than I warned you about. They're exactly what you warned me about, Ethan corrected. I just didn't realize how much it would piss me off to watch them treat you like a charity case. I'm used to it. That's worse. You shouldn't have to be used to your own family dismissing your work like it's a phase you'll grow out of. We'd reached the far end of the gardens where the landscaping gave way to natural desert, saguaros standing like sentinels against the darkening sky. I could still hear the party behind us, music and laughter and the clink of glasses, but out here it felt separate, like we'd stepped outside the performance. Preston wasn't always like this, I said, surprising myself with the admission. When we were kids, before he figured out how the family dynamics worked, he was actually a decent big brother. Taught me how to ride a bike, helped me with homework, took my side when I got in trouble for reading during dinner parties. What changed? He learned that being the golden child came with rewards. And that maintaining that position meant being better than everyone else, especially me. It's not personal, really. I'm just the control group that proves he made all the right choices. Ethan was quiet for a moment, looking out at the desert. You know what's going to be really satisfying? When they find out. Find out what? About GridSync. About the investment deals you're closing. About the fact that the sister they've been treating like a failed experiment is about to disrupt an entire industry. I hadn't told him yet about the term sheet I'd received 2 days ago, the one from the impact investment firm in Boulder that wanted to lead a series of funding round at a valuation that had made me read the email 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. I hadn't told anyone except my lawyer, too superstitious to celebrate before the papers were signed. How did you know about that? He grinned. I didn't know specifically, but I've seen your projections and I've watched you work. It was a matter of time. So, did you sign? Not yet. Still reviewing the terms with my lawyer. But probably yes. Then in a few months, you're going to be running a funded startup with real resources and a path to scale. And Preston's going to be exactly where he is now, making good money doing work that could be done by any competent lawyer with the right connections. You sound satisfied about that. I'm satisfied about you getting what you've earned. The fact that it will make your family reassess their entire judgment of your life choices is just a bonus. We started walking back toward the party, and I felt something settle in my chest, a certainty I hadn't felt before. Ethan was right. Not about revenge, not about proving them wrong for the sake of it, but about the simple truth that good work eventually speaks for itself. I didn't need their approval. I just needed to keep building. The party was winding down when we made it back inside. Guests were saying their goodbyes, praising the evening, promising to see each other at the wedding. Preston and Vanessa stood near the entrance doing farewell rounds like politicians, all smiles and handshakes and promises to stay in touch. We were almost to the door when Preston caught my arm. "Hey Nat, got a second?" I nodded to Ethan that I'd meet him outside, and Preston steered me into my father's study, closing the door behind us. The room smelled like leather and expensive scotch, masculine and imposing in the way all of my father's spaces were. "Look, I'm sorry if I embarrassed you with that speech," Preston said, and he actually looked sincere. "I was trying to be funny, but I think it landed wrong. You called me a naive idealist who hasn't figured out what she wants to be when she grows up. In front of 200 people. I know. It was a cheap shot. But come on, you have to admit your situation is a little concerning. You're 30 years old, Nat. You quit a decent job to chase some startup dream, you're living in an apartment that's barely bigger than my closet, and you're dating a guy who installs solar panels for a living. Mom and Dad are worried about you. I'm worried about you. Worried about me or worried about what I'm doing to the family image?" He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Can't it be both? Look, I get that you want to make a difference or whatever, but at some point you have to be practical. This grid sync thing, is it even close to viable? Are you talking to real investors or just people who say nice things at networking events?" I could have told him then. Could have mentioned the term sheet sitting in my email, the serious conversations with serious people who took my work seriously. But something stopped me, some instinct that this information was ammunition I didn't want to give him yet. "I'm closer than you think," I said instead. "But I appreciate your concern. I'm being serious, Nat. If you need help, if you need an introduction to people who could give you advice or maybe find you a position at a real company, I can make that happen. There's no shame in admitting this isn't working out. It is working out. You just can't see it yet." He sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Fine. Do your thing. But when you're ready to get serious about your career, about your future, the offer stands. Family takes care of family, even when we make questionable choices." I left the study before I said something I'd regret. Found Ethan waiting by his truck, leaning against the driver's side door and looking up at the stars like he was mapping constellations. "Ready to escape?" he asked. "More than ready. Take me anywhere that's not here." The term sheet became a signed agreement 3 weeks after Preston's engagement party. GridSync Technologies officially had series of funding, a small but talented team, and 18 months to prove that our technology could scale beyond simulation and prototype into real-world implementation. The first check hit my account on a Tuesday morning, and I sat staring at my laptop screen for 10 minutes, convinced there had been some kind of banking error. Keisha insisted we celebrate, dragging me to a nice restaurant where we drank wine that didn't come from a box, and I tried to wrap my head around the fact that I was suddenly responsible for other people's livelihoods and investor expectations. The elation mixed with terror in equal measure, settling in my stomach like I'd swallowed something that was still moving. Ethan brought champagne to my apartment that night, the good kind that he definitely couldn't afford on a small business owner's budget, and we toasted to the beginning of something real. "How does it feel?" he asked, settled on my couch with his legs stretched out, looking more relaxed than I felt. "Terrifying. Exciting. Like I just signed up to climb Everest and I'm not entirely sure I remembered to pack oxygen." "You've got this. I've seen the way you think through problems, the way you refuse to settle for solutions that only kind of work. That's exactly what this needs." We've been spending most of our free time together over the past few months, ever since the engagement party. It had shifted from colleagues working on a project to something that felt more substantial, though neither of us had explicitly labeled it. He'd fixed my apartment's ancient furnace when it died in November. I'd helped him negotiate a contract with a school district in Colorado Springs. We had dinner together more nights than not, fell asleep on each other's couches reviewing technical documents, knew each other's coffee orders by heart. I need to hire someone who actually knows what they're doing with business operations, I said, already making mental lists of everything I didn't know how to do. I can build the technology, but I have no idea how to structure a company, manage payroll, navigate regulatory compliance. I might know someone, Ethan said. Guy I went to grad school with, worked at Tesla for 5 years running their supply chain operations, just left because he was tired of building luxury toys. He's been looking for something with actual mission alignment. Can you introduce us? Already sent him your info. He'll reach out this week. That was Ethan, always 3 steps ahead, anticipating needs before I articulated them. It should have annoyed me, that presumption that he knew what I needed, but instead it felt like having a partner who was genuinely invested in the success of something beyond his own immediate interests. My parents called that weekend, my mother's voice bright with forced enthusiasm. Natalie, sweetie, your father and I were talking and we realized we haven't seen you in months. Why don't you come down for a visit? We could have a nice family dinner, catch up properly. Things are pretty busy right now, Mom. I just closed a funding round for GridSync and I'm building out the team. A funding round? What does that mean exactly? I explained as simply as I could, leaving out the specific numbers because I knew she'd find a way to make even success sound insufficient. She made appropriate interested noises, but I could hear the distraction in her voice, like she was doing something else while I talked. Well, that all sounds very promising, dear. I'm sure your father will want to hear more about it. Oh, Preston mentioned you brought someone to the engagement party. Is that serious? It might be. We're taking it slow. What was his name again? Eric? Ethan. And he runs a renewable energy company. Right, the installation work. Well, I hope he's good to you, sweetheart. You deserve someone stable. The implication hung there, unspoken but clear. Someone stable, unlike the chaotic path I'd chosen for myself. Someone who could balance out my impractical dreams with real-world sensibility. I let it go, too tired to pick apart the subtle criticism woven through everything she said. The next 6 months blurred together in the way startup growth does, everything moving too fast and too slow simultaneously. We hired the operations guy Ethan had recommended, brought on 3 engineers who were better at hardware integration than I was, found office space in a light industrial building near downtown Denver that was cheap and functional if not impressive. The first full-scale pilot project went into a rural community outside Fort Collins, a neighborhood of about 40 homes that had been hit hard by recent utility rate increases. The installation took 3 months, plagued by all the problems you'd expect when trying to implement new technology in real-world conditions with real-world constraints. Panels arrived late. The AI distribution software had bugs we hadn't caught in testing. Local building codes required modifications we hadn't anticipated. I spent more nights sleeping on the office couch than in my own bed, living on coffee and stubbornness. But it worked. By late spring, that community had reduced their collective energy costs by 60%, the system was running smoothly, and we had documentation proving that GridSync could deliver on its promises at scale. The data was beautiful, the kind of results that made all the sleepless nights and near-panic attacks worth it. News started spreading in the way news does in the renewable energy sector, through conference presentations and industry publications and word of mouth among people who actually cared about implementation rather than just talking about it. A reporter from a regional Colorado paper did a feature on the Fort Collins project. An industry trade magazine wrote up the technology. Ethan's phone started ringing with calls from other communities asking if GridSync could help them. I was too buried in the work to pay much attention to the growing interest, focused on solving the immediate problems in front of me. We had 2 more pilot projects starting in summer, a waiting list of communities who wanted to be next, and investor pressure to prove we could replicate the Fort Collins success consistently. Preston's wedding invitation arrived in June, heavy cardstock in an expensive envelope, my name written in calligraphy that probably cost more per letter than I used to spend on lunch. The ceremony would be at a resort in Sedona, black tie required, 3 days of events leading up to the main wedding. My mother called to confirm I'd received it and to ask, with painful casualness, whether I was planning to bring a guest. Ethan will come if he can get away from work, I said. Things are pretty intense right now. Of course, dear. Though it would be nice if you could both make time for family. This is Preston's big day. I promised I'd be there for the important parts and hung up feeling that familiar weight settle on my shoulders, the sense that no matter what I accomplished, I'd always be the disappointing daughter who couldn't even prioritize her brother's wedding properly. Ethan found me that evening in the office, surrounded by electrical diagrams and empty coffee cups, trying to solve a load balancing problem that kept creating bottlenecks in the distribution algorithm. You're going to burn out, he said, not unkindly, setting a container of Thai food on my desk. When's the last time you slept in an actual bed? Tuesday maybe. What day is it now? Thursday. Eat something that isn't caffeine. I picked at the pad Thai while he reviewed my work, making small suggestions that immediately improved the algorithm in ways I should have seen myself but couldn't through the fog of exhaustion. Preston's wedding is in 6 weeks, I said. My mother's already started the guilt trip about me not being present enough for the planning process. Never mind that I'm not actually involved in the planning. Do you want to go? Want to is a strong phrase. I should go, and I will go, and it will be several days of everyone asking what I'm doing with my life in that concerned voice that really means they think I'm failing. Ethan was quiet for a moment, then said carefully, what if by the time we get to Sedona, you had something concrete to point to? Something that would make it very clear you're not failing at anything? The pilot projects aren't enough? I'm not talking about the pilot projects. He pulled up something on his phone, then handed it to me. Got an email today from a producer at CNN. They're doing a series on young innovators disrupting traditional industries, and someone recommended GridSync. They want to interview you for their Power Player Spotlight segment. I stared at the email, reading it 3 times to make sure I was understanding correctly. CNN. National television. The kind of exposure that either launched companies into the stratosphere or revealed all their flaws under harsh scrutiny. When would they want to do this? They're filming in Atlanta in 3 weeks. You'd fly out, spend a day doing the interview and B-roll footage, then they'd air it sometime in the following month. He paused. Probably right around when Preston's getting married, if we're being honest about timing. The implications settled over me slowly. My family would see it. Everyone at the wedding would see it. Preston's moment would be interrupted by news that his failure sister had just been featured on national television as an innovator worth watching. That feels petty, I said. It's not petty. It's accurate reporting on legitimate business success happening to air at an inconvenient time for your brother's ego. Those are very different things. He was right, but I still felt uneasy about it. Then again, I'd spent my entire life trying not to outshine Preston, making myself smaller so he could feel bigger. Maybe it was time to stop managing his feelings for him. Okay, I said. Tell them yes. The next 3 weeks were chaos choreographed as productivity. We had to get the second pilot project far enough along that I could leave for 2 days without everything falling apart. I had to prepare for the interview, working with a media consultant the investors hired to make sure I could explain GridSync in terms that general audiences would understand without dumbing it down so much that it sounded trivial. Ethan helped me practice, asking the kinds of questions reporters might ask, pointing out when I fell into technical jargon or when I wasn't explaining the real-world impact clearly enough. We sat in my apartment night after night, him playing interviewer while I refined my answers, until I could tell the GridSync story in a way that was both accurate and compelling. Why does this matter? He asked during one practice session, playing the skeptical journalist. There are lots of renewable energy companies. What makes GridSync different? Because we're not trying to sell solar panels to people who can already afford them, I said, the answer coming more easily now after dozens of repetitions. We're making clean energy accessible to communities that have been priced out of the renewable revolution. Rural areas, low-income neighborhoods, places where the infrastructure is aging and the utility companies have no financial incentive to upgrade. GridSync isn't about maximizing profit margins. It's about solving a problem that matters. Better, Ethan said. but lose the phrase, renewable revolution. It sounds like marketing copy. What would you say instead? Say it's about making clean energy work for people who need it most instead of just people who can afford it. More direct, less abstract. He was right. He was almost always right about this stuff, seeing through to the core of what needed to be communicated in a way that my technical brain sometimes missed. The flight to Atlanta was early morning, and I barely slept the night before, too wired with anxiety and anticipation. Keisha had helped me pick out clothes that looked professional without trying too hard, and I'd gotten my hair cut for the first time in months at a salon that didn't have a Groupon deal. The CNN studios were smaller than I expected but more intimidating, all glass and sharp angles and people moving with purposeful efficiency. The producer who met me was friendly in that brisk professional way, walking me through what would happen, where I'd sit, what kinds of questions Richard Chen would ask. "We'll do the interview first, then get some footage of you with the technology," she explained. "We're also sending a crew to Colorado to film the Fort Collins installation, get some testimonials from residents who are using grid sync. Should make for a compelling visual story." Richard Chen was exactly as polished in person as he appeared on television, but warmer, immediately putting me at ease with small talk about Denver and whether I'd tried the barbecue place near the studio. When the cameras started rolling, he shifted into interview mode, and I felt my nerves settle into focus. Natalie Harper is 30 years old and she's already disrupting an industry that's been resistant to change for decades, he began, looking straight at the camera with that authoritative news anchor presence. Her company GridSync Technologies has developed an AI-driven system that makes renewable energy accessible to communities that have been left behind by traditional utility models. Natalie, thank you for joining us. Thanks for having me. Let's start with the basic question. What is GridSync and why does it matter? I took a breath and delivered the explanation we'd practiced, talking about modular microgrids and AI distribution optimization but focusing on what it meant in human terms. Lower energy costs for families who were struggling. Energy independence for rural communities. Clean power that didn't require winning the geographic lottery of living somewhere utilities wanted to invest. You could have taken a traditional path, Richard said. You have a degree from a respected engineering program, you worked in consulting. Why walk away from that to start something from scratch? Because consulting let me see all the places where the system was failing, all the problems that weren't being solved because they weren't profitable enough to matter. I got tired of writing reports that sat in filing cabinets while people continued to struggle with energy costs they couldn't afford. GridSync exists because I wanted to build something that actually helped instead of just documenting what needed to be helped. That's idealistic. Some might say naive. How do you respond to people who say you're too focused on mission and not enough on business fundamentals? I smiled at that, thinking of Preston's speech at his engagement party. I'd say that good business fundamentals and meaningful mission aren't mutually exclusive. GridSync has strong unit economics, we're hitting our growth targets, and our investors are happy with our progress. But we're doing it in a way that prioritizes impact alongside returns. That's not naive. That's just refusing to accept that profit and purpose can't coexist. The interview continued for another 40 minutes, Richard asking smart questions that pushed me to explain not just what GridSync did but why it mattered, how we'd scaled, what challenges we'd faced. He asked about being a young woman in a male-dominated industry, about the technical challenges of AI implementation, about where I saw clean energy going in the next decade. I answered honestly, trying to balance confidence with humility, passion with pragmatism. The version of myself that showed up in that interview was someone I barely recognized, someone who sounded certain about things I'd been uncertain about for years. After the cameras stopped, Richard shook my hand and said something that stuck with me. You should be proud of what you're building. Not just the technology but the way you talk about it. A lot of entrepreneurs in your position would focus entirely on the business opportunity or the tech innovation. You never lost sight of the people you're trying to help. That matters. The crew followed me back to Denver to film the Fort Collins installation, getting shots of the solar arrays and the distribution equipment, interviewing residents about what the system had meant for their monthly budgets. An older woman named Patricia told the camera that GridSync had saved her from having to choose between electricity and medication. A young father talked about finally being able to afford air conditioning in summer for his kids. Those testimonials meant more than any technical achievement, validation that we'd actually solved a problem that mattered to real people living real lives. The producer said the segment would air in about 3 weeks, right in their prime evening slot. She couldn't guarantee exactly when, but probably late July or early August. I did the math in my head. Preston's wedding was the second weekend in August. I flew back to Denver feeling lighter than I had in months, like I'd cleared some hurdle I hadn't known I was running toward. Ethan picked me up from the airport, and I could see the question in his face before he asked it. How'd it go? I think it went well. I don't know. It's impossible to tell how these things land until they actually air. You want to get dinner and debrief? We ended up at the taco truck near his shop, sitting at a picnic table in the parking lot while I replayed the interview from memory, analyzing every answer I'd given and whether I should have said something differently. You're overthinking it, Ethan said, stealing one of my tacos. I guarantee you nailed it. How can you possibly guarantee that? Because I've watched you explain grid sync to investors, to engineers, to community members, to my mom when she asked what you did for work. You know how to make people understand why this matters. That's your superpower. I let that sink in, wanting to believe him but too cautious to fully commit to optimism. Preston's going to lose his mind if this airs during his wedding week. Preston's going to lose his mind regardless. At least this way you get something out of it. That's not why I did the interview. I know. But it's okay to enjoy the timing anyway. The wedding weekend began with a rehearsal dinner at a resort restaurant overlooking red rock formations that glowed amber in the sunset. Preston and Vanessa had spared no expense, transforming the space into something that looked like it belonged in a luxury magazine spread. I arrived with Ethan, both of us dressed appropriately but not extravagantly, and immediately felt the weight of family scrutiny settle over us like humidity. My mother spotted us first, her smile freezing slightly when she registered Ethan's presence before recovering into hostess mode. She kissed my cheek and shook Ethan's hand with the kind of polite warmth that communicated absolutely nothing. So glad you both could make it. Natalie, you look tired. Have you been sleeping enough? Work's been busy. Good busy. Well, try to relax this weekend. It's important to be present for family. Preston worked the room like he was running for office, Vanessa glued to his side in a dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. When he finally made his way to us, his handshake with Ethan was firm enough to be aggressive. Good to see you again, man. Still doing the solar panel thing? Among other things, Ethan replied evenly. Right. Hey Nat, Dad wants to talk to you about something. He's over by the bar. I found my father deep in conversation with Gerald Sterling and several other men in expensive suits, all of them holding glasses of scotch like props in a performance about success. He broke away when he saw me, steering me toward a quieter corner. Natalie, I've been meaning to talk to you. Gerald mentioned his firm is looking to invest in renewable energy companies, diversifying their portfolio. I told him about your little project and he's interested in learning more. GridSync isn't looking for additional investors right now. We're fully funded through our Series A. My father blinked, surprised. Series A? That's significant funding. $8.5 million. We closed in January. He processed this information, his expression shifting through several emotions before settling on something that looked almost like respect. That's impressive. Why didn't you mention this? I did mention it. Mom called it promising and changed the subject. Well, still, Gerald's connections could be valuable. Even if you're not raising money now, relationships with firms like Sterling Investments can open doors down the road. I'll keep that in mind. The dinner proceeded through multiple courses, speeches praising Preston and Vanessa's perfect partnership, toasts to their future. I sat at a table with cousins I barely knew, making small talk about their jobs and children while Ethan charmed an aunt who kept asking him increasingly specific questions about solar panel efficiency ratings. My phone buzzed during dessert. A text from the CNN producer with a date and time. The interview would air in 3 days, right in the middle of Preston's wedding events. I showed Ethan, who raised his eyebrows but said nothing. The actual wedding day arrived with cloudless Arizona sky and temperatures that made standing outside informal wear feel like punishment. The ceremony was beautiful in that expensive, impersonal way, everything coordinated and photographed and performed for an audience. Preston looked genuinely happy, and I felt a complicated mix of emotions watching him exchange vows with Vanessa. Pride that my brother had found someone, resentment at the path he'd walked to get here, sadness that we'd never been close in any way that mattered. The reception was held in a massive ballroom transformed into something that resembled an enchanted garden, if enchanted gardens had open bars and a live band that probably cost more than my car. I just finished congratulating Preston and Vanessa when my phone started buzzing incessantly. Text after text from people I knew in the industry. Calls from numbers I didn't recognize. Keisha sending a string of incomprehensible excited emojis. I stepped outside into the desert heat and opened my news app. The CNN interview had aired early, bumped up in the schedule because of breaking news pushing other segments. My face stared back at me from the screen, the headline reading, 30-year-old engineer disrupts energy industry with AI-powered microgrids. I stood there in the parking lot watching my own interview on my phone, barely recognizing the confident person on screen who spoke about grid sync like it was inevitable rather than improbable. The piece was good, better than I'd hoped, weaving together the technical innovation with human impact stories from Fort Collins residents. It made grid sync look not just promising but essential. Back inside the reception, people were starting to notice. I watched phones come out, watched guests lean together whispering and glancing in my direction. Preston was mid-speech when someone at a front table apparently pulled up the CNN segment, the glow of their screen visible even from where I stood. He powered through the toast, professional to the end, but I saw the moment he registered what was happening, the slight tightness around his eyes. When he finished and the applause died down, my father appeared at my elbow. "Natalie, people are asking me about a CNN interview. What's going on?" I handed him my phone with the segment pulled up. Watched his face as he watched it, seeing the moment he realized his disappointing daughter had just been featured on national television as someone worth paying attention to. This aired today? During the wedding? I didn't control the timing. They moved it up in the schedule. My mother materialized beside him, watched the segment over his shoulder, her expression unreadable. "Well, this is unexpected." "It's wonderful," my father corrected, and I heard something new in his voice. Not quite pride, but close to it. "Natalie, why didn't you tell us things had progressed this far?" "I tried. You weren't interested in the details." Preston found us moments later, Vanessa trailing behind looking confused about why the wedding reception had suddenly become about his sister. His smile was tight, controlled. "Quite a day for news, Nat CNN, that's big time." "I didn't plan the timing." "Sure. Just interesting how these things work out." He glanced around at the guests who were now more interested in their phones than the wedding. "Anyway, congratulations. Really impressive." I could hear what he wasn't saying, the anger buried under layers of politeness. This was supposed to be his day, his moment to shine, and I'd inadvertently stolen focus just by existing in my own success. "Preston, I'm sorry if this is awkward timing." That genuinely wasn't intentional. He studied my face for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. "You know what? I believe you. And honestly, good for you. I might have underestimated what you were building." It wasn't an apology for years of dismissal, wasn't acknowledgement of how he'd treated me. But it was something, a crack in the wall he'd built between us. The rest of the evening was surreal. Family members who'd barely spoken to me all weekend suddenly wanted to know about grid sync, about my plans, about whether I needed connections or advice. Gerald Sterling cornered me to discuss investment opportunities with an intensity that felt desperate. My mother introduced me to people as her daughter who'd just been on CNN, pride finally creeping into her voice. Ethan found me on a balcony overlooking the resort grounds, escaping the sudden attention. He handed me a glass of champagne and leaned against the railing beside me. "How are you holding up?" "I don't know. This feels weird." "Weird how?" Like I spent 30 years being invisible and suddenly everyone can see me, but only because CNN told them I was worth looking at. Nothing about me actually changed. Just their perception. That's exactly what changed. You've been doing work that matters for years. Now people who couldn't see it before don't have any excuse. We stood there in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the red rocks in shades of orange and purple. My phone buzzed again. More texts, more calls, more attention than I knew what to do with. What happens now? I asked. Now you go back to Denver and keep building. Let them catch up in their own time. He was right. This moment, this vindication, it felt good, but it wasn't the point. The point was the work, the communities we were helping, the problems we were solving. Everything else was just noise. Inside, the band started playing again. Through the windows I could see Preston and Vanessa dancing, their moment reclaimed. My parents talking with guests, probably explaining their daughter's sudden prominence. All of them recalibrating their understanding of who I was and what I'd built. I didn't need their approval anymore. But standing there with Ethan, watching the family that had dismissed me for so long finally see me clearly, I couldn't help feeling that maybe, just maybe, they'd learned something about recognizing worth before the world tells you it's valuable. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.